I never thought I'd run out of my house to find a gun pointed at my grandmother's face, but that's exactly what happened on a quiet Thursday morning in Maplewood Estates. And the worst part, it wasn't a robber. It wasn't a stranger. It was our own HOA president, Karen Whitmore, standing there with her arms stretched out, hands shaking, screaming about a rule she invented just 3 days earlier. And my grandmother, barely able to walk, trapped in her wheelchair, was apparently her newest criminal. The image burned into my mind before I even understood I was screaming her name, before I realized I was running faster than my body even knew how. But let me back up, because nothing about that moment makes sense unless you understand the insanity that came before it. I've lived in Maplewood Estates for 6 years, long enough to think I'd seen everything an HOA could throw at people. Overpriced violation letters, surprise inspections, those passive-aggressive newsletters, reminding us that community standards begin with you. Maplewood was peaceful, beautiful, manicured, and controlled by a board that treated the handbook like Holy Scripture, and presiding over it all, sitting on her metaphorical throne, was Karen. If the HOA had a queen, she was it. Clipboard always in hand, sunglasses always on attitude, always set to maximum authority. Karen wasn't just strict. No, that word is way too gentle. Karen was obsessive. I've watched her fine a guy because his grass grew 1 millimeter too tall, and yes, she measured it. I've seen her threaten to report a teenager for walking suspiciously fast. I even watched her knock on a neighbor's door at 6 a.m. to tell them their porch light was the wrong shade of white. I wish I were joking. People stopped joking about her a long time ago. Then came her ultimate masterpiece of madness, the No-Wheel Zone Act. That was the moment we all realized something was seriously wrong. She held an emergency HOA meeting, just her, a printed banner, and about 12 confused residents, and declared her new vision for the future of Maplewood mobility. According to her, the community needed to return to simpler, purer forms of movement. What did that mean? Apparently banning anything with wheels. We all laughed. We thought she was targeting kids' scooters and electric skateboards. But Karen doesn't do normal. Karen does extreme. She meant everything. Bicycles, grocery carts, wagons, doll strollers, even wheelchairs. I remember thinking, no way, she can't be serious. But we underestimated how far she'd go. Karen interpreted her rule like she was auditioning for the Supreme Court of bad decisions. And unfortunately, she believed she had the authority to enforce it. My grandmother Helen came to visit the day after the rule went up. She's 78, sharp as a tack, tougher than most people I know, and definitely not the kind of woman who scares easily. She'd lived through things Karen couldn't even spell. But when she stepped out of the car, she noticed something strange immediately. The neighborhood felt off. People were walking stiff slow, like they were afraid of being accused of moving too boldly. Conversations happened in whispers. And everyone avoided Karen's house like it was surrounded by invisible lasers. I explained the new wheel rule to her, and she actually laughed. "Sweetheart, you're exaggerating," she said, until she saw Karen burst out of her house to yell at a boy for rolling a marble on the sidewalk. A marble. The kid froze like he'd committed a federal crime, and Karen held her clipboard like she was writing the laws of the universe. My grandmother leaned toward me and whispered, "This woman needs holy water." I wish that was the worst she'd say about Karen. The morning everything happened, the air was too calm, like the universe was preparing for chaos. My grandmother rolled herself onto the porch to get some sun while I stayed inside finishing a movie. For a few minutes, everything felt quiet, peaceful. Birds chirping, breeze moving gently through the trees, the kind of morning that tricks you into thinking life is soft. Then I heard voices outside, sharp, raised, panicked. At first I thought it was a regular neighbor argument. We're used to those. But then I heard another sound, fear, real fear, a trembling, cracking plea that didn't sound like any adult I knew. It was my grandmother. I sprinted out the front door and froze at the top of the steps. Karen stood there, arms locked straight, pointing a gun, an actual gun, at my grandmother, who was still seated in her wheelchair like she'd stumbled into a nightmare. Karen's face was flushed red, her voice shaking, but icy cold. "You are violating the no-wheel zone," she shouted. "You can't be out here. This is non-compliant mobility equipment." My grandmother looked confused, scared, pressing her hands against the armrests like she might somehow stand up and run. Before I could reach them, before I even fully understood what I was seeing, Karen stepped forward and shoved her, hard. Everything slowed down. The wheelchair flipped sideways. My grandmother's body twisted and fell, hitting the pavement with a sound I'll hear in my sleep for years. The metal frame clanged against the ground. She cried out in pain. I swear the world went silent for a moment, like even nature couldn't process what had just happened. I dropped to my knees beside her, sliding to her side so fast I scraped my own palms on the concrete. She was shaking her arm, bleeding where the skin tore open. Her voice trembled as she tried to breathe through the shock. I felt myself unraveling, not angry, not yet, just destroyed, helpless, horrified that someone I loved was on the ground because of something this senseless. And while I held her, Karen didn't stop. She didn't show remorse. She didn't even blink. She stood there with the gun still in her hand, yelling about regulations and community safety like she lived in a different reality. Neighbors started gathering slowly, cautiously, whispering with wide eyes. A few recorded on their phones. Others just stared at Karen like she'd finally revealed the monster she'd been hiding. I fumbled for my phone hands, shaking, and dialed 911. My voice cracked as I explained what happened. The operator stayed calm, saying help was on the way, but every second felt like an hour. My grandmother winced each time she moved. I could see the fear in her eyes, a kind of helplessness I'd never seen on her face. And that's when something inside me broke. For a moment I doubted myself. I wondered if I should have done more earlier, if I should have stood up to Karen before she escalated this far. I felt guilty, like somehow letting the HOA run wild made me part of the problem. I hated that the thought crossed my mind, but it did. When you live under someone like Karen long enough, you start to question your own instincts. You start to wonder if maybe the rules make sense, maybe you're overreacting, maybe letting it go is easier. But looking at my grandmother bleeding on the ground, something snapped me out of it. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. I wasn't going to let Karen intimidate this entire neighborhood into silence. Not after this. Not ever again. The police arrived fast, thank God. They stepped between Karen and my grandmother, took the gun, disarmed her, and ordered her to put her hands behind her back. And that was the first time I saw Karen freeze. Her power didn't work on real authority. She shouted that she was the HOA president, but the officers didn't care. They arrested her right there in front of half the neighborhood. My grandmother was lifted onto a stretcher and taken to the hospital. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but they were serious bruising cuts, a minor concussion. But the emotional shock, that was deeper. I visited her every day, holding her hand while she rested and telling her the neighborhood was standing with her. And they were. Everyone who'd been too scared to speak before suddenly found their voices. Statements were filed, videos were turned in. The HOA board tried to distance themselves so fast it was almost comical. Karen's trial came a month later, and it felt like the entire neighborhood packed into that courtroom. She didn't look like the Karen we were used to. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no superiority. She looked small, shaken, like the weight of what she'd done finally settled on her, even if she didn't want to admit it. When the charges were read, assault with a deadly weapon, elder abuse brandishing a firearm, reckless endangerment, she didn't argue, she didn't scream about the rules, she didn't blame anyone. She whispered one word, guilty. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in state prison and ordered her to pay $48,000 in restitution. I didn't cheer. None of us did. But when the verdict was read, my grandmother squeezed my hand gently. Not in triumph, not in celebration, just relief. As officers led Karen away, I watched her glance back at the room filled with people she once believed she ruled over. And for the first time ever she understood the truth. The power she worshipped had never been real. It was borrowed authority built on fear, and once fear vanished, so did she. And even though the neighborhood didn't erupt in applause or celebration, I could feel something shifting in the air, a pressure, lifting a weight, dissolving. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates felt like a community again. We didn't win because Karen was punished. We won because we finally stood up. All of us. We remembered our voices mattered. We remembered that rules exist to protect people, not to control them. And we remembered that silence, even when comfortable, is never harmless. If there's anything this whole nightmare taught me, it's this. When power goes unchecked, it doesn't just grow, it devours. And the only thing strong enough to stop it is someone finally saying enough.